Good morning, church family. Glad to be with you in our daily Bible study. I'm going to ask you a question as we start. What's your favorite form of communication? For many of us, right now, C and I are writing letters to our grandkids, and they're writing back in their little second grade and kindergarten ways, and we just absolutely love getting a letter from them in the mail. Some of us, it's the telephone. Some of it's email and texting, and maybe tweeting and Facebook, and there's some problems if this is your primary way of communication sometimes. Huge consequences of too much digital communication and not enough maybe face-to-face. There's a lot of studies being done about that. What's the problem with all these forms of communication other than face-to-face? The problem is sometimes interpretation, sometimes emotions and sarcasm and inflection and tone. It's so easy to misunderstand when we're doing things by text or by email. All of you've been there where you've sent something out that's innocent and innocuous, and then somebody takes it wrong because they just didn't understand exactly what you're trying to say. You've all been there. But if you have something very, very important to say, something of substance and something that's very, very important, what's the very best way to communicate? Face to face. Actually sitting down with somebody and talking with that person, having a conversation. And to many people, that is a lost art these days. In the school business, we're doing this thing on virtual learning, and it is just, there's a gap there when you don't get to have those conversations with your teacher. I hear a lot of times that people my age are looking for doctors. What they're looking for is somebody that will listen to you and sit down and actually talk to you. You've been there. I've been there. That's what we're looking for. So today in our text, we're going to be in John, the first chapter, in the Gospel of John, chapter 1. We're going to go from verse 1 through 18 about how God communicates with us. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor of a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John, testifying concerning him, said, "This is the one I spoke about, who said, 'He who comes after me surpasses me because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is the closest relationship with the Father, has made him known." There are a few passages in the Scripture that are more beautiful than this one. It's poetic, but it is rich, and I think that it's rich because it conveys in such a beautiful term who God is and who Christ is. This idea of the Word, many of you who study the Bible know that's the Greek word logos, and we've taught that this refers to Christ, and that's correct. But that terminology, the logos, and the meaning behind it is somewhat lost in the translation sometimes. About 300 to 400 years before Christ, Greek was the language. Greeks came and conquered the world, and they forced their language on everybody. So at the time of Christ, at the time of John's writing, the Greek Septuagint, I'm not that big of a scholar, but that's the scriptures they had was the Greek words, and so they all spoke Greek, and they knew that. This word logos was much richer to them than it probably is to us today. Some of it gets lost. But in the Old Testament, if you look for that same word in Genesis 15, it's a word that talks about God communicating to Abraham. In Psalm 36, that same word says it is how God created the heavens and the earth. There's this idea that this logos in John 1 is the way that God communicates, but it's also the way that he creates. Listen to Hebrews 1. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in different ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir over all things, and through him also who made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had made provision for purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So he became as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. So we started off talking about what's your best way of communication. Jesus, this Logos, is God's best way of communicating to us, then and today as well. He used the prophets, he used the written word, the Torah, they had that. But when it came time to really tell us what we need to know and show us what we need to know, something that's important, something that's personal, something that's emotional, the best way to do that is face to face. And that's what John is telling us here. The Hebrews tells Jesus that, in Hebrews it says that Jesus is the radiance of God, the exact representation of God himself. When we see Jesus, we see God. John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus is God's best way of communicating with us. You know, our words are important. As you try to teach a lesson like this, you try to pick your words, but more important than that, Jesus says in Matthew 12, out of the heart the mouth speaks. Your words convey who you are. As I talk to you during the week, as I'm on the phone with you or visiting with you, you get a sense of who I am by what I talk about and how I talk. And that same happens with you as well. I can kind of get a reading on you by the way you talk. And so we get to see who God is by listening to these words that God speaks as we listen to God's words. God's Logos, God's words reveal exactly who he is and what his nature is, what his personality is, and what his character is. He says this in verse 18. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God. He is the closest relationship with the Father, and he has made him known. Made me think about that time in John 14, where Jesus is talking about going away. He's going to go to his Father and prepare places for his followers. And the guys say, wait a minute, we don't know where you're going. And Jesus says, yeah, you do. You know, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And then I think it was Philip said, hey, we don't, show us the Father. And Jesus over in John 14, verse 6, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you will know him and have, because you've seen him. And Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough. And Jesus says, don't you know me? Even after I have been among you so long, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Man, it's hard to get this. It's hard to grasp this. When we see Jesus, we see God. And we are very fortunate that God cared enough about mankind to have this face-to-face conversation with us through the Word rather than just the Old Testament Scriptures, rather than just sending an email or a text. I want you to think about how different our understanding of God would be if he had not chosen to have this face-to-face interaction with us. Think about if we only had the Torah, if we only had the first 5 books, if we only had the prophets, or if you want to go in the New Testament, if we only had Paul's letters. Think about if we had no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What would our understanding of God be? Think about what we know because of the Gospels. We know about the love for the lost because we have the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. We know about Jesus and who he thought was important because he hung out with sinners and tax collectors and those who his heart poured out to. We know about this woman at the well in John 4, that he had a love for not just for the Jews, but for the Samaritans and the Gentiles and for the disenfranchised. We get to see God hanging on a cross and saying, forgive them for they don't know what they do. We get to see God and know God because of these words, this Logos, this communication. We need to be prayerfully thankful today as you study John 1 that God had this conversation with us by giving us the Gospels. So what is revealed about God in these few verses here? Number one, God created, Jesus created. Everything that was made was part of creation. Jesus was there. Sometimes we think that Jesus was an afterthought, but Jesus was there from the very beginning, wherever the beginning was. I can't figure that out. I'm not smart enough, but it's part of the Trinity, part of that triune God. And he had his hand on everything. He said nothing was created without Jesus and God there. Number two, Jesus is the light. I love this description. You see it often in John's writing. There's this contrast between light and darkness. Of course, light being the good from God and darkness being the evil from Satan. I love that word picture. It's like kind of like in a scary movie when there's always darkness and the person goes in the room and we just scream at them, turn on the light, and they never turn on the light. And it's that kind of way today. People have a choice. Do you turn the light switch on and accept Jesus, or do you leave it dark and suffer the consequences? Many people refuse to accept the light. It says here in John 1 that the people rejected him as the light. His own people chose to reject him and chose to live in darkness. Light symbolizes hope. Light illuminates the path and shows us the way, and light symbolizes salvation. But there's a choice that has to be made. You can accept the light and move into the light, or you can stay in darkness. And the last thing I want to bring out is this logos. This light brings grace to us. Verse 16, out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. When God sent his son as this atonement, he gave a permanent way to deal with sin that had never been there before. We now have access to that grace. God's way of satisfying his holiness and his justice by taking on the sins of the world himself, that's grace, giving us all access to this grace in Jesus Christ. So today, as you read in John 1, I would also take you to 1 John 1 in your studies today. Spend some time not just reading, but spend some time in prayer, thanking God for loving us enough to have a face-to-face conversation with us about the Logos and not just sending us an email. God bless you.